of psychotic terror bombs and butchering innocent civilians. Yesterday, as Charles Hill, heading of babies, and Dale Francis Albanese was served as the Nazi blood-buying commissioner to human rights. Yesterday, as Charles Hill was Palestinian territories, employed Francis Albanese, who serves as the Israel High Commissioner for Human Rights, Special Rapporteur for Palestinian territories. Employed, we're here to talk about it today. Israel has no right to be seen on the news against Hamas diplomats like Francesca Albanese and many others. We're here to talk about agencies engaged in the work of licensing, encouraging, minimizing, diplomats like Francesca Albanese. What is going on at the UN? They look civilized as UN agencies engaged in the work of licensing, encouraging, legitimizing UN entities are a member's hatred of Israel. What's going on at the UN? They look civilized, but in fact, what is going on is more of that cause. The activities of UN entities are anti-Semitism for all of my 43 years in the U.S. genocidal attacks, including early 1982, Moscow, Leningrad, on behalf of that cause, Soviet Jews. I've been doing a fight here for anti-Semitism for all of my 43 years in anti-Semitism, and many more early 1982, Moscow, Leningrad, on behalf of Soviet Jews. And broke the law that created a special on hearings that focused exclusively on anti-Semitism state, and many more focused on later. Wrote another law that is upgraded and strengthened, and wrote a law that created a special envoy monitoring committee directly to the Secretary of the U.S. Department of State. Kathy Manning and Rob later wrote another law that is upgraded and that bill, the special envoy, ambassador, and the Senator directly to the Secretary of State. I'm going to Kathy Manning and Rob made it happen with the USA. I want to say, Rob, when that bill, Kathy Manning and 6 other members of and I co-chaired the bipartisan task force. I'm going to come back and try to make it happen over the U.S. What we see at the UN is anti-Semitism. Kathy Manning and 6 other members and I co-genocidal bipartisan limited native combating anti-Semitism. And what we see at the UN in June 2004 and at the UN Human Rights Conference, genocidal, powerfully limited, articulated his incisive and a hearing I chaired in June of 2004 and at the UN Conference, Nathan Sharon said that powerfully articulated his words in incisive 3D of his work, identifying issue. If you want it as really successful in the struggle against it, then it is often high against any other year. There must be more of clarity on the issue of Israel. What we're talking about, of course, is if you wanted to find the line of study in the struggle against anti-Semitism as against any other evil, Israel is a strong democracy in the issues. In the way you're talking about, it is built as important as to find the line between legitimate criticism around Israel, of course, anti-Semitic all forms of Israel is a strong democracy, the only democracy. Very important, the only difference, and it is built on criticism from within and from within. Of course, I support the third one for legitimate criticism. It's very important to see this 3D test that is nothing less than, according to the Indoctrination specified in the third time before, what it passes over into demonization of Jews. This 3D test is nothing less than legitimizing the Jewish state of Israel, or classifying the anti-Semitic standard. What it passes over into demonization of Jews for every other country in Israel. Demonizing the Jewish state entity, or modifying the standards. That is UNRWA for Israel and the standard works for every other country on the globe. As we all know, it's set up in we now about refugees. Most than 40 years later, it is still got UNRWA, the UN Reserve and Works Agency. Nearly every government set up in 1949 to provide aid for refugees to integrate 74 years. How do they welcome the Palestinians? Nearly every Arab nation provides education in order to Jews integrate into their society. How do they welcome grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the original refugee education in hundreds of Jews was vastly curriculum. Children are camps, grandchildren, and grandchildren are of the original refugees, incubators, hundreds of teachers. Aspects of its propaganda camps, official media, and all the all unavailable incubators go online and read what they have aspects of its propaganda, encourage children to martyrdom and suicide publicly available. You can read it, form on child minds and read that. What they have to little kids, they encourage children to martyrdom people as suicide bombers. What a form of child abuse. It's report by UN tells you to kids and they are here to blow up innocent people in places. From March this year, carefully documented report by UN watching the packets and systematically hires teachers who publicly portray this year, carefully documents glorified terrorist attacks against Israeli children, systematically hires teachers who publicly portray you can put your hands down. Glorified terrorist attacks attacks against Israeli children and spread titles of late conspiracy theories against Israel. Quote. UN of over 100 UNRWA teachers and their Facebook pages inciting anti-Semitism and praise of jihadi terrorism, and it makes very, very grim reading. UN Watch has released a new report 2 days ago, on November 6th, documented how, quote, as soon as news of the horrific slaughter broke, which was live streamed on social media by some of the terrorists, United Nations Relief and Works Agency, or UNRWA, staff immediately celebrated and justified it on Facebook. Celebrated the slaughter of innocent people. As the report states, this is a symptom, and this is a quote from the UN Watch, of a much larger systemic problem, the fact that UNRWA hires anti-Semitic terrorist supporting staff in the first place, close quote. UNRWA bears a heavy moral responsibility for the perversity we saw performed by Hamas in this October 7th invasion of Israel. I would point out that in 2018, because of all this, President Trump ceased all funding to UNRWA. Regrettably, President Biden reversed that policy and has given UNRWA approximately $1 billion. Where are the strings? Where's the reform? Has not happened. The UN Human Rights Council is a hypocritical institution. And I was there when we tried, we went from the commission to the council. Everybody talked about how it would be made so much better, transparent, and really focused on egregious violations of human rights. Well, it is a place where the world's worst human rights abusers have made Israel a permanent agenda item so as to able to demonize it at every meeting. Its commissions of inquiry on Israel and reports are beyond biased, based on unsubstantiated reports and strained logic. Their only purpose is to put a mantle on apparent authority on wild accusations of Israel's worst enemies. We are fortunate to have three wonderful and very effective leaders. We're also very, and I would welcome UN Watch, Hillel Neuer, who is the world's leading authority on the Human Rights Council, who will testify today in part, because his testimony is very, very comprehensive. And he points out that, quote, since the creation in June of 2006 to June 2023, the Council has adopted 0 resolutions on serial human rights abusers such as China. I chair the China Commission. It's a bicameral, bipartisan commission. I've chaired 81 commission hearings and hearings in this committee. The egregious abuses committed by Xi Jinping are beyond the pale. You name it. Genocide against the Uyghurs, all of the terrible abuses, and yet crickets, nothing from the Human Rights Council. Again, going back to Hillel Neuer's statement, he points out 0 resolutions on abusers like China, Pakistan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Zimbabwe, and Cuba. It adopted 2 condemnatory resolutions on Sudan, 3 on Venezuela, 12 on Eritrea, 14 on Iran, 16 on North Korea, 42 on Syria, and guess what? 103 on Israel. China, nothing. Israel, 103. It's absurd. Shockingly, Iran chaired the UN Human Rights Council Social Forum on November 2nd and 3rd. I mean, what is that all about? Put them at the helm as the chair of that forum. The UN General Assembly is infamous for annually adopting between 60 to 20 resolutions condemning Israel. Again, I thank Hillel Neuer for his reporting on this. But an average of 12 country-specific resolutions on the rest of the world combined. That's incredible. One of the worst was in 1975 when UNRWA, the UN General Assembly, Resolution 3246, addressed the Palestinians and, quote, and I quote it, reaffirms the legitimacy of the people's struggle for liberation from alien subjugation by all available means, including armed struggle. That was from the UN. This was written to legitimize Palestinian terrorism and Hamas and other terrorist organizations, and they do it regularly, and it's cited regularly. It must be repealed, just as Zionism is racism resolution was repealed. And I remind members, and we went through this when we were on the floor discussing Hamas. Read the Hamas Charter of 1988. Clearly, it talks about openly, aggressively killing Jews. It says Israel has no right to exist and needs to be eviscerated from the face of the earth. It's right there in black and white, and they're doing it. Why are we surprised? The UN Security Council has been, since October 7th, unwilling to condemn Hamas or to acknowledge Israel's right to self-defense. And we all remember, because again, I was here, when Yasser Arafat couldn't even come here because he refused to recognize Israel's right to exist. He gave some very, very weak statement and then was allowed to come to the United Nations. But that Israel's right to exist has still not been accepted by so many at the UN. The UN Secretary General has done even worse, saying Hamas's atrocities did not happen in a vacuum, and then pointing to 56 years of suffocating occupation. Secretary General Antonio Guterres claimed he was not justifying Hamas, but in fact he is relativizing and excusing them. Thankfully, Israel has an ambassador to the UN, Gilead Erdan, who had the strength of character to call out the Secretary General. I would note, parenthetically, he was scheduled to be here today. He will come at a future hearing, but situation in New York required his presence there and could not make it. The relevant context for understanding Hamas's genocide atrocities is provided by the UN itself and its persistent, morally bankrupt policy of promoting anti-Semitic grievances and justifying anti-Semitic violence. Finally, there is a web of bodies dedicated solely to harming Israel. I mentioned one a moment ago with Ms. Albanese and her statements. The Special Committee to Investigate Israeli Practices affecting the Palestinian people. The Committee on the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. They are funded by the General Assembly, which means we're funding them, and function solely as propaganda channels for anti-Semitism, grievances, and maligning Israel. There is no similar committee on any other country in the world. So, again, I want to thank you. I'd like to yield to my very distinguished and good friend, Ms. Wild, for any opening comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I am glad we're having this hearing. I thank all of you for being here, particularly the witnesses for taking time and the people who are here to give witness to this hearing and the substance of it. As we know, this is an incredibly difficult time for so many people across our nation, across the world, and in my own community in Pennsylvania. And that includes Jews, Muslims, Arab Americans of different faiths, people of other faiths, and all of those who have been overcome by grief since October 7th and over the subsequent weeks. I think we are all in a period of collective mourning to some extent or another. And let me first say, may we all think of the 240 hostages and work for their release as soon as possible. That must be foremost in all of our minds. We cannot find the words to express our grief, and far too often we find ourselves divided in our pain rather than united in our common humanity. As a Jew myself, I value the existence of the State of Israel, and I condemn all forms of anti-Semitism. But time and again, I have said to my many constituents of many different faiths that no human life is worth more than any other to me. I hold in my heart every life that hangs in the balance, and I'm ready to work with anyone to make any degree of progress in addressing this devastating crisis. We all need to work together to bring about a peaceful existence and a place to live for everyone. But sadly, this is a time of war, and I will say, parenthetically, I reject any claim that Israel caused or instigated this war. Having said that, while this hearing will shine a light on many issues and challenges that the United States and the United Nations face to improve the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East, colloquially known as UNRWA, we also need to recognize that UNRWA and other partners are working to deliver essential humanitarian aid to meet the emergency needs of innocent civilians in Gaza. We know that the humanitarian needs are only going to rise, and we must be cognizant that UNRWA is the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza, and that without UNRWA, assistance simply cannot be delivered. Right now, UNRWA is working and coordinating responses with other excellent agencies like World Food Program, an agency that I am very familiar with, have seen up close and personal in other countries, and I'm very impressed by, and to ensure that civilians are able to receive critical humanitarian assistance consisting of food, water, shelter, and medical care. And I think we all know that the humanitarian crisis is huge. It's not being completely addressed by any means. It may not even be possible to completely address the humanitarian crisis that is happening there. But we must try, UNRWA must try, and its partner organizations. So in this challenging moment, when it's really hard to feel any kind of hope for the future, we have a responsibility, I feel, for the sake of future generations, to engage in robust, proactive diplomacy on the international stage. That means working to strengthen and improve agencies, including UNRWA and the UN system, across the board, not walking away from our international commitments. And together, I feel that we must find a way forward. And so I look forward to this hearing, Mr. Chairman, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Berg? Okay. Ms. Manning.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Wild, and thank you to all of our witnesses for joining us today. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your leadership as the co-chair of the House Bipartisan Task Force for Combating Anti-Semitism, which met yesterday, and all of your efforts over many years to bring important focus and attention to this fight. And thank you, Representative Wild, for bringing the issue of the hostages front and center to this hearing. As you know, we've been meeting with hostage families for the last 3 weeks, and much like the stories of Holocaust survivors, each story of a hostage family is unique, each story is heartbreaking, and we must continue to do everything we can to bring the hostages home. Anti-Semitism is on the rise here in the U.S. and around the world, and we must stand up to anti-Semitism in all of its forms. As ADL CEO Jonathan Greenblatt said yesterday, before the Hamas attack on Israel, anti-Semitism was at a crisis level. Since that horrific Hamas terrorist attack on October 7th, anti-Semitism is a catastrophe. There is no question that certain UN member states, bodies, and the General Assembly have a negative, disproportionate focus on Israel and routinely support singling it out more than any other country in the world. This single-minded negative focus on Israel undermines the credibility of the UN, and it distracts from serious challenges facing the world. One-sided UN resolutions do not advance peace. They single out one side of the conflict for blame, while encouraging the other side to reject direct negotiations in favor of a unilateral strategy. It also removes any sense of agency or responsibility from one side, and that removes the incentive to work assiduously toward peace. A lasting peace agreement will only come from direct negotiations from two sides. It cannot be imposed by an international organization such as the United Nations. I'm glad that the United States has regularly vetoed biased and one-sided resolutions at the UN, including a recent UN Security Council resolution on the situation in the Middle East, which failed to mention Israel's right of self-defense. And in response to the recent absurdity that a country that slaughters girls and women for failing to wear their headscarves properly, Iran, would chair the United Nations Human Rights Council Social Forum, the U.S. has rightly boycotted this two-day meeting. My colleagues and I have also long raised concerns about the problematic content in textbooks used by UNRWA schools in the West Bank and Gaza, where biased and discriminatory curriculum is determined by the host government. We will continue to insist that this content be removed. At the same time, many UN agencies provide essential services, such as vaccines for children and other critical services around the world, including in countries where neither the host government nor any alternative can or will provide those services. The UN General Assembly last year approved an Israeli-sponsored resolution condemning Holocaust denial, and agencies like UNESCO support Holocaust education and programs to counter anti-Semitism, which we can agree are important and worthwhile. UN agencies are imperfect, and in certain cases they are even seriously flawed. At the same time, the United States tends to have more influence when we have a seat at the table. So I'm looking forward to hearing what we can do to push for reform, to fix the flaws, and ensure that intolerance, incitement, and bias against Israel, the Jewish people, or any people will not be permitted. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Dr. Barr?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. This is a challenging time in the world right now. And you know, I've been to Israel twice in the last few months this past summer. Been to Surat, have had lunch at some of the kibbutzes in the past that were attacked. For those of us that believe in Israel's right to exist, for those of us that believe in Israel's right to defend itself, but also firmly believe in a two-state solution and as the only path to peace and stability, it seems so far away today. I talked to one of my Palestinian constituents last week who's lost relatives and friends in Gaza. I hear the same anguish and pain that I heard after October 7th in my Jewish constituents, in their deep grief and deep loss. And that's the tragedy here. Israel has a right to prosecute a war against Hamas. They were attacked and they have a right to defend themselves. They have a right to make sure this never happens again. They have a right to dismember, dismantle, and to the best extent eliminate Hamas. But when you see tragic loss of innocent civilian life, you also feel that pain. And I do support President Biden's call for a humanitarian pause to get food, water, medicine into civilians that need that. Again, that's not talking against Israel's right to defend itself. That's not talking about it against Israel's right to exist. That is the American position, and we'll firmly support that position. But when you think about a two-state solution, when you think about a future, is a future ever possible at this particular point in time where Palestinians and Israelis can live side by side? We've got to try to hold on to that possibility. Otherwise, I fear, my Israeli friends will never be able to live in peace, and certainly, I don't know what occupation looks like in Gaza. I worry about that. So, challenging time. We will stand with Israel. But this is a time where I would hope Arab nations and others around the world work with us to find peace, find a path forward where Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side, but again, a place where Israelis can feel comfortable that the heinous attacks of October 7th will never happen again. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the Chairman and Ranking Member for having this hearing. Let me in advance thank the witnesses, not just for your testimony today, which I've perused and I know will be informative, but for your work, long work in addressing the issues we face, in particular, Mr. Noor, your work on the UN and the long historic bias we've seen. Grateful for all of you for being here. We were able to host last month. We were visited by Erwin Kotler, another strong voice from Canada, and he talked about the attack on October 7th. It's insufficient to call it an attack. The massacre, the invasion into Israel of thousands of terrorists seeking to kill, torture, rape, kidnap innocent people with the declared intention of the destruction of the state of Israel and the murder of Jews. And I may not get the words exactly right, but the idea he shared is that what happened on October 7th is incomprehensible. You try to watch the videos, by the way, taken by the attackers. And it's impossible. He said it was incomprehensible, but it was not impossible because we saw it happen. We know what happened. And we look at the response from the United Nations, and the tragedy is it's not incomprehensible. It's totally expected. It's what they've been doing for literally decades. And I think that's what we're here to talk about today. And specifically, when we talk about UNRWA, with, I think, everyone on this panel, I've had the privilege of visiting Israel at different times. Ms. Manning and I had the chance to talk to young students in Ramallah. Students who shared the dreams that our kids have in the United States, that the kids in Israel have, wanted to be doctors and engineers and scientists and change the world for the better. And then the question was asked of them, what do you think of the Israelis? And their answer, tone, and view changed completely. And they began to describe to us the very things we see and know are being taught in the schools, in the UNRWA schools. The education of our kids is the most important thing that we do. It not only determines their prospects for success as adults, it determines the prospects in the future of the country educating those children. Decades of educating children to hate is how you achieve a situation like October 7th, when people literally kill children in front of their parents, kill parents in front of their children, literally burn people alive. And that's why I think the conversation we're about to have today is so important. The need for peace is greater today than it's ever been. The challenge for peace in the immediate moment seems all but impossible. But the importance to have the conversations today, when it comes to the time for questions, I'm going to ask you, why are there refugee camps in Gaza after 75 years? We'll talk about that. It doesn't make any sense. But imagine after this war is over, after Gaza is free from the control of Hamas, a genocidal, nihilistic terrorist organization seeking the destruction of Israel, when the Gazans are free to rebuild their society and their community, and instead of tunnels and terrorist cells, they're building a shiny city like Doha or Abu Dhabi, giving their kids the prospects of a future, like I said, we all want for all of our children. That's what we need to see. And with respect to the calls of a ceasefire, if you watch the news today, Israel has encircled Gaza City, has taken control from Hamas from the perimeter. And what's the first thing that happens? The first thing that happens is Israel allows civilians to flee to safety in the south. Why are they fleeing now? They're fleeing now because they're able to. They didn't flee before because Hamas prohibited it. And that's what we need people to see. So I hold the dream for the future. I continue to pray for the safety of all the civilians. I will say that those who were silent on October 7th, their silence then drowns out any protest they may have today. We have to be clear in our condemnation of what Hamas did and our focus on a peaceful future, but it cannot happen until Hamas is defeated. I yield back.
Thank you so very much. Without objection, testimony that is being submitted for the record by Duvi Honig, who is the founder and CEO of the Orthodox Jewish Chamber of Commerce, will be made a part of the record. And also testimony by Debbie Soffin, who has been provided me and my staff for years information on UNRWA, and I thank her for that, will be made a part of the record as well. And I do want to recognize Marcus Sheff, who's here from Impact SC. We look forward to your testimony in a future hearing, because I've read your reports. They're very, very incisive, and I thank you for it. And we did invite Deborah Lipstadt, who is our ambassador at large, and she had a genuine conflict of interest and couldn't be here, so the invitation is open, and I know she'll avail herself of it and will come at our very next hearing, which will be very, very soon. So I'd like to introduce Hillel Neuer, who's the executive director of UN Watch, a human rights NGO in Geneva, Switzerland. He is also international lawyer, diplomat, writer, and activist. He has testified often before the United Nations and the United States Senate and the House. Mr. Neuer taught international human rights at the Geneva School of Diplomacy and served as vice president of the NGO Special Committee on Human Rights in Geneva. He is frequently quoted as an expert, and sure he is. I read his website all the time, on the United Nations and human rights by leading newspapers, including the Wall Street Journal, Telegraph, Le Monde, New York Times, and has appeared in debates on CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera. Without objection, his full bio and all of our witnesses will be made a part of the record. And then we'll hear from Jonathan Schanzer, who is Senior Vice President for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where he oversees the work of the organization's experts and scholars. He is also on leadership team of FTD's Center on Economic and Financial Power, a project on the use of financial and economic power as a tool of statecraft. Jonathan previously worked as a terrorism finance analyst at the U.S. Department of Treasury, where he played an integral role in the designation of numerous terrorist financiers. He has held previous think tank research positions at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and Middle East Forum. He has written hundreds of articles on the Middle East. We'll then hear from Jonathan Lincoln, who is the director of the Center for Jewish Civilization. Prior to joining CJC, he worked with the United Nations in a variety of capacities since 2005. Most recently, Jonathan served as the Senior Coordination Officer for the UN Special Coordinator's Office, based in Jerusalem, working on the coordination of UN and international development assistance to Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. Previously, from 2012 until 2017, he was Senior Political Officer at the UN's Department of Political Affairs in New York, where he covered political developments in North Africa and supported UN interventions in Algeria, Libya, Morocco, Tunisia, and Western Sahara. Mr. Noor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Wild, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify at this important hearing. I've come here from Geneva, from the headquarters of the United Nations Human Rights Council, to report to you on how that and other key UN bodies, as well as high UN officials, are engaged in the systematic demonization of Israel, even in the aftermath of last month's massacre by Hamas. Mr. Chairman, the United Nations was founded in wake of the Nazi atrocities. This year marks the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was created in response to barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. 1 month ago, on October 7th, Hamas sent thousands of terrorists to infiltrate into Israel. They broke into more than a dozen communities, massacred entire families, committing horrific and sadistic acts. They slaughtered 260 young people at a music festival. On that day in total, Hamas murdered more than 1,400 people. There are moments in this life, said President Joe Biden, when pure, unadulterated evil is unleashed on this world. The people of Israel lived through one such moment this weekend. This was an act of sheer evil, quote unquote. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak likewise said, the attacks in Israel shocked the world. Over 1,400 people murdered one by one. The elderly, men, women, children, babies in arms, murdered, mutilated, burned alive. We should call it by its name. It was a pogrom. Mr. Chairman, what one would expect the United Nations, likewise, to speak clearly and denounce barbarous acts which have shocked the conscience of mankind. Yet, this is not what has been happening. Instead, over the past month, despite some condemnations of Hamas, the overwhelming majority of statements by UN bodies and officials have been pointing the finger at Israel, expressly or by implication. The most excited and emotive declarations by the UN's highest officials describing suffering in Gaza are directed at Israel. Never does the UN blame Hamas for launching the war, for embedding themselves inside hospitals, homes, schools, and mosques. There are almost no such posts about the massacre of October 7th, about millions of Israelis subjected even now to rocket attacks, hundreds of thousands of Israelis displaced, more than 200 hostages being held by Hamas. All of these are not being championed in the UN's dramatic social media and statements. The target is always Israel. Now, often this is done by misrepresenting basic facts, such as falsely accusing Israel of bombing a hospital when the culprit was actually the Islamic Jihad, falsely characterizing Israel's legitimate self-defense aimed at targeting terrorists as, quote, collective punishment or other crimes, creating false moral equivalence between such self-defense and the terrorists, misusing numbers of Gaza dead, not telling us the source of the data is Hamas, not telling us how many of those dead are terrorists, including those killed in Israel, and pretending that proportionality is about comparing death tolls when in fact it's about using proportional means to achieve a valid military objective. Now, the UN Charter guarantees the equal rights of nations large and small, yet nowhere is this principle more violated than when it comes to the UN's treatment of Israel. At the UN General Assembly last year, there was one resolution on Iran, one on Syria, one on North Korea, and 15 on Israel. 0 resolutions were adopted on China, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and 180 other countries. At the UNGA, any resolution targeting Israel is passed by an automatic majority. This was on display 2 weeks ago when the GA adopted an Arab-drafted resolution calling for a ceasefire after, outrageously, they rejected a Canadian amendment that would have condemned Hamas for the massacre and demanded the release of over 200 Israeli hostages, including children, babies, and elderly grandmothers. So the text adopted by the GA failed to even mention the word Hamas, failed to recognize Israel's right and duty to defend its citizens against terrorism. Now, at the World Health Organization, every year its annual assembly deviates from global public health for a special debate singling out Israel. There is no such focus on Syria, where hospitals are repeatedly bombed by Syrian and Russian forces, nor on North Korea, one of the worst health systems in the world. On the contrary, the WHO recently elected North Korea to its executive board. Since the Hamas massacre, the vast majority of statements by the WHO have targeted Israel. Hamas is seldom mentioned. The director, Dr. Tedros, is posting numerous statements falsely implying that Israel targets hospitals. He fails to say that Israel's military abides by the law of armed conflict, expends enormous efforts to avoid harming civilians, while Hamas's strategy, on the contrary, is to embed itself inside hospitals, homes, schools, and mosques to use Gaza civilians as human shields. So on October 17th, Dr. Tedros rushed to quote on Twitter to strongly condemn the attack on Al-Ali Arab Hospital in Gaza. Early reports indicate hundreds of deaths and injuries, he wrote. He called for Israel's evacuation order to be reversed in that area, and he ended with the hashtag not a target. Now, in truth, Israel never targeted or even attacked that hospital, and there were no hundreds killed. The US, France, Britain, and Canada all confirmed Israel's analysis showing the explosion was caused by a failed rocket launch by Islamic Jihad. Dr. Tedros never corrected his false accusation, never deleted his tweet. Likewise, 2 days ago, he posted a call for a ceasefire without any mention of the word Hamas. Israel's right to self-defense, to stop Hamas from carrying out their stated intentions by one of their top officials to repeat the massacre of October 7th was nowhere mentioned. At the UN's Human Rights Council, most of the world's serial abusers get a free pass. Many sit on the council, including Qatar, Kazakhstan, and Pakistan. Last month, they re-elected the regimes of China and Cuba. None has ever been censured. Last week, when the Human Rights Council opened its social forum, the chair was the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, while dictators are honored, a democracy is scapegoated. The only country in the world with a standing agenda item at the Council is not China, which denies basic human rights to 1.5 billion people, as you well know, Mr. Chairman, nor is it Iran, which beats, blinds, and poisons women and girls for protesting, and which sponsors Hamas terrorism. Instead, the agenda item is on Israel. From the Council's creation until today, it's adopted more resolutions on Israel than on Iran, Syria, and North Korea combined. In May 2021, after Hamas and the Jihad fired 4,000 rockets at Israeli civilian centers, they created at the Council a commission of inquiry targeting Israel. It's the first that has no end date. It is mandated to report in perpetuity. Its unprecedented scope includes a mandate to examine root causes of the conflict, which include alleged systematic discrimination based on race. As chair of the inquiry, the Council appointed Navi Pillay, someone who has signed petitions lobbying governments to, quote, sanction apartheid Israel. She's the chair. UN Watch has documented her bias in a legal request that we submitted to Ms. Pillay, demanding that she recuse herself. She ignored our petition. Another commissioner is Milun Kotari. Last year, he gave an interview where he ranted about the Jewish lobby and questioned Israel's right to be a member of the UN. He was condemned by numerous countries and even UN officials for anti-Semitism, yet he remains in his post. Not surprisingly, in the inquiry's most recent press statement on October 16th, they create a false moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas, refusing to treat Hamas as a terrorist organization, refusing to affirm Israel's right to self-defense. In a recent Al Jazeera interview, Navi Pillay effectively explained away Hamas's atrocities as somehow inevitable, and she made false comparisons with Nelson Mandela. Now, other officials need to be examined. Last year, the Council named Francesca Albanese as its special rapporteur on Palestine. The mandate is to investigate only Israel's violations. UN experts are obliged to be objective. Before she was appointed, I informed the Council that Albanese has repeatedly equating the suffering of Palestinians with the Nazi Holocaust and accused Israel of war crimes, apartheid, and genocide. In a 2014 Facebook post, she said America is, quote, subjugated by the Jewish lobby. Still, the Council went ahead and appointed her. Ever since, Albanese has used her UN post to legitimize terrorism. Last November, she addressed a Hamas conference where she said, quote, you have a right to resist. This is a UN human rights expert encouraging Hamas last November. 6 days ago, she led 6 other supposed UN experts to accuse Israel of attempting, quote, genocide. This insane charge was also made a few days prior by Craig Mohiber, the outgoing head of the UN Human Rights Office in New York, and a manifesto that he published as an open letter to the UN where he implied he was quitting as an act of conscience. Now, this supposed moral protest was covered immediately by The Guardian and Al Jazeera. What they did not report was that Mr. Mohiber actually had to leave his job now, that he was under an investigation since March after we exposed his litany of social media posts describing Israel in terms of infinite evil. Finally, we need to address UNRWA, which in 2022 alone received $344 million in U.S. funding. Under the slogan, Peace Starts Here, UNRWA tells donor states that they educate Palestinians about human rights and peace, that they promote stability. Yet today we've released a new report, Hate Starts Here, how UNRWA teachers indoctrinate Palestinian children and incite anti-Semitism. It can be found at unwatch.org. Our last report documented how UNRWA staff regularly call to murder Jews and create teaching materials that glorify terrorism, encourage martyrdom, demonize Israelis, and incite anti-Semitism. We had identified over 100 UNRWA teachers and staff found to promote hate and violence in social media. Our new report today examines how UNRWA staff reacted to the Hamas massacre. As soon as news of the slaughter broke, they immediately celebrated it on Facebook. Allah is great, Allah is great. Reality surpasses our wildest dreams, posted UNRWA Gaza teacher Osama Ahmed. UNRWA principal Iman Hassan justified the massacre as restoring rights and redressing grievances. Rawia Hellis, director of UNRWA's Khan Yunis Training Center, featured in an UNRWA video, glorified one of the terrorists as a hero and a prince. UNRWA English teacher Asma Rafiq Kuhel called to sculpture the date, adding the emoji of a heart. UNRWA school administrator Hamada Ahmed posted, welcome to the Great October. Finally, there's an UNRWA official, Mohammed Al-Sheikh Ali. He features on our report on page 16. He recently posted the following: anyone who talks about taking refuge in Sinai is a traitor. Anyone who tries to flee to the south should be treated the way we ought to treat traitors. Mr. Chairman, in other words, we have someone identifying himself on Facebook as an UNRWA official with prominent photos of him receiving UNRWA awards, calling on Hamas to execute Gazans who want to go south to flee for safety to get away from Hamas. In closing, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, on the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, key bodies and officials of the United Nations are exploiting and distorting the language of human rights, the basic concepts of international law, in order to cast Israel as a racist and genocidal state, as the manifestation of infinite evil, even as it is trying to defend itself from one of the most horrific mass terrorist attacks of our time. At a moment when the world needs moral clarity and leadership, the UN has failed. Its actions only incentivize Hamas to continue their strategy of using Palestinians as human shields and maximizing casualties. The United Nations will never live up to its founding premise so long as this pathology endures. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Noor, for that testimony. Dr. Shanzer?
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Weil, distinguished members of the subcommittee, on behalf of FDD, I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I want to thank my fellow panelists here as well for their leadership. Okay. Anyway, thank you for the opportunity to testify. The UN's anti-Israel bias, as you just heard, is out of control. It's not just a problem of anti-Semitism, and it hasn't just diverted resources from other serious problems around the world. It has created the conditions for a regional war that is now threatening the Middle East. In other words, the UN has actually undermined its own mission of protecting the rules-based international order. In my written testimony, I take aim at several UN organizations that waste taxpayer funds or exhibit a demented obsession with Israel, but no organization exemplifies the UN's failures better than the UN Relief and Works Agency, otherwise known as UNRWA. The agency was originally created to assist Palestinians displaced by the 1948 war that the Arab states waged against Israel and subsequently lost. From early on, however, it was clear that UNRWA viewed the Palestinians as clients. They refused to permanently resettle them, and then they became the rationale for additional funding year after year. Over time, UNRWA's clients grew old and passed on, but that was bad for business. So UNRWA expanded the definition of Palestinian refugees to include the descendants of refugees. So as a result, UNRWA's registry has ballooned from 700,000 in 1948 to 5.9 million today. Mathematically impossible. Despite the fact that only few of the original refugees are alive today, UNRWA's roster continues to grow, and all of them claim the so-called right of return to lands inside Israel. In other words, UNRWA has extended the Palestinian-Israeli conflict deliberately and indefinitely. UNRWA today also identifies 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank as refugees. I'll remind you, these are people living in the Palestinian territories, so this hardly qualifies them as being refugees. UNRWA today has a whopping 30,000 employees. And in case you're wondering, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees serves more than 90 million people around the world with 19,000 on staff. So it's almost as if the UN is trying to say that the Palestinian issue is more important than any other problem anywhere around the world. UNRWA employees have been exposed as members of Hamas, the terrorist group that slaughtered 1,400 Israelis in cold blood on October 7th. This might explain how UNRWA's educational materials refer to Israel as the enemy, teach math by counting martyred terrorists, and include the phrase jihad as one of the doors to paradise in grammar lessons. Now, of course, there are some that might argue that right now is the wrong time to criticize UNRWA, given that there is an actual refugee crisis that is going on in Gaza right now. So let me be clear. Criticizing UNRWA need not ignore the needs of destitute Palestinians or those in crisis, and it need not ignore the intentions of well-meaning relief workers, some of whom have died during the current Gaza conflict. UNRWA may yet have an important role to play in this crisis, but UNRWA must begin to acknowledge its serious problems, and it must begin to enact meaningful reform. The agency, however, continues to deny its dysfunction. In fact, UNRWA has an office, I believe, right here on K Street that tries to convince legislators such as yourselves that it is doing a great job. If you ask me, this sounds like a lobby. So now what? Congress has some hard work ahead. The first step is to actually apply refugee status to only people who were refugees from 1948 and 1949. This would right-size UNRWA's mission right off the bat. From there, an impartial board of directors must be installed to conduct effective oversight. UNRWA actually doesn't have one. They don't have oversight of themselves. After that, there should be a full screening of UNRWA employees for terrorist affiliations. We know there are many. Then, educational material must be scrubbed of anti-Semitism and incitement against Israel. We've heard already that our friends from Impact SC are here, and they've done a great job of exposing a lot of what is in those materials. Finally, there needs to be plans for the phasing out of UNRWA over time. It may not be now, given the crisis that we're watching, but there needs to be a plan for handing off the mission of UNRWA to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. There should only be one agency that deals with refugees worldwide. The Palestinian one has failed. I should also just note that I think that shutting down that DC office might also be a good idea. Before I conclude, I would like to add a few words about the UN International Forces in Lebanon, otherwise known as UNIFIL. The agency's mandate, as you probably know, is preventing non-state actors from acquiring weapons in Lebanon. Yet it did nothing for 17 years while the Iran-backed Hezbollah amassed an arsenal of some 200,000 rockets, as well as precision-guided munitions, lethal munitions, and drones. Since October 8th, the day after the massacre in southern Israel, Hezbollah has fired more than a dozen anti-tank missiles at Israel every day. A full-blown war could erupt at any moment. And I think it's fair to ask at this point whether the UN failed or whether it was a partner in the current crisis. Either way, Washington must seriously consider ending UNIFIL's mandate. Something else can be created if a mechanism for dialogue between Israel and the Hezbollah-backed government in Lebanon is needed. But change is desperately needed. I'll end here. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for holding this hearing. I thank you for allowing me to speak today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Schanzer. Mr. Lincoln.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Wild, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify. With your permission, I'll summarize the written testimony. I'm not here to defend every aspect of the UN system, far from it. But based on 15 years working with the UN, including in Gaza, Jerusalem, and Ramallah, also on post-conflict arrangements in 2006 after Israel's war with Hezbollah, I'm in a position to perhaps help explain the political and operational environment on the ground. To start with, of course, as many have mentioned, the scope and brutality of the October 7th terrorist attack on Israel and the kidnapping of some 240 Israelis, including children and the elderly, by Hamas has forever changed the country, its relations with the world, and brought the long-standing conflict with the Palestinians into a new era. With the war now entering new phases, Palestinian civilians in Gaza are facing a calamity of historic proportions. The UN and UNRWA in particular are not just the best placed entities to provide the urgent life-saving assistance needed on the ground, they are the only option. The numbers are no doubt familiar, but they are staggering. More than 10,000 reported killed, including more than 4,000 children, of course, according to Gaza's Ministry of Health. There are some 725,000 internally displaced persons at 149 UN facilities. These numbers grow as Israel calls on the population to flee the areas of heaviest fighting around Gaza City. Medical supplies, fuel, food, water are running low. Facilities for sewage treatment, water desalination have either been damaged, shut down, or are working at reduced capacity. In coordination with Israel, aid has started to flow from Egypt, but in insufficient quantities, according to the UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Secretary Blinken and the administration have been calling for humanitarian pauses, which are the least of what is urgently required. There is no other way to ensure increased aid other than with UN and in particular UNRWA support. UNRWA is for all intents and purposes the state. It cannot be compared to any other UN agency. No other UN agency functions in that way. It plays a vital stabilizing role in the context of the fighting, and of course will do so with regard to any day after scenario. The alternative is chaos and possible systems collapse, posing a danger first and foremost for the Palestinian civilians, but clearly for Israel as well. From an operations perspective, UNRWA is considered a reliable partner for many donors and has always maintained a close and relatively trusted relationship with the Israel Defense Forces with regard to its operations. Eventually, in the context of post-conflict arrangements, there will be a need to review, and in some cases, I would even go further than what the others have said with regard to an overhaul concerning the structure, political, operational shortcomings of the United Nations and UNRWA in particular. This must include an examination of anti-Semitism and bias against Israel. But to be sure, efforts to defund UNRWA, as happened from 2018 to 2021, have failed. as the agency managed, with relative ease, to make up for the shortfall with other donors. It's hard to imagine a different result, especially in the current context. The existing agreements between the US and UNRWA need to be expanded and strengthened. In addition to the concerns about bias presented here today, many donor countries have additional concerns about UNRWA's management, accountability framework, that was raised today as well, its financial stability that need to be addressed. Replacing UNRWA with other UN agencies is unrealistic, if not impossible, due to its entirely unique operational structure and direct assistance model. Substantial change can happen only in the context of a multilateral approach between the US, European Union, Gulf states, and other donors. The more connected the post-conflict and any effort to reform the UN are to the renewal of a viable peace process, the greater the chance of success. In conclusion, the late Kofi Annan famously stated, quote, "A United Nations that fails to be at the forefront of the fight against anti-Semitism and other forms of racism denies its history and undermines its future. That obligation links us to the Jewish people and to the State of Israel, which rose, like the United Nations itself, from the ashes of the Holocaust." He also said, "When we seek justice for the Palestinians, as we must, let us firmly disavow anyone who tries to use that cause to incite hatred against Jews in Israel or elsewhere." Current UN leadership and parts of the system have certainly failed to grasp the magnitude of the October 7th attacks for Israel and much of the Jewish world, and in doing so have failed to live up to these standards. But despite its shortcomings, the UN is far too important an organization for the US to disengage from. This is both for the sake of Palestinians, Israelis, and the world. For now, the priority must be to support urgent relief and life-saving assistance to civilians in Gaza. There will also soon be an opportunity to make the UN a more effective organization and one that can better live up to the legacy of Kofi Annan.
Thank you. Thank you all for your testimonies. To begin the questioning, you mentioned a moment ago how Dr. Tedros has not in any way, shape, or form retracted his false statements. Just for the record, you know, I've met with Dr. Tedros when he was the Minister for Health in Ethiopia, and he often lied on behalf of Meles, who was then the head of state there, when they had cholera outbreaks. So he had a very checkered background going into that position as Director General of the World Health Organization. He got his job by way of the Chinese Communist Party in Xi Jinping. He was their candidate, and we saw that there was a great deal of disinformation, if not outright lying, when COVID broke out, as he did the work of the Xi Jinping's dictatorship in putting out a false narrative. So I'm no great fan at all. I supported the Brit who ran, who was all about reforming the WHO. But, you know, again, these people need to be held to account when they make statements. And for him to smear Israel and not retract it and, frankly, offer a fulsome apology, again, goes to his integrity. And integrity matters. And I've been shocked at the fact that he has not come forward and said, wait, I got it wrong. Let me just correct that and apologize to the Israelis. Nothing of the sort. Just goes on to the next disinformation campaign. So if you might want to speak to that. The issue of diversion of aid. We know that so much of the aid from the European Union, and as well as from us, gets diverted by Hamas. You know, what should have gone into infrastructure went into tunneling. And even a lot of the aid, we believe, that is being sent to UNRWA is diverted in other ways. It's hard to say because there's no independent accountability whatsoever. And, you know, Mr. Lincoln, maybe you could speak to the issue of, you know, if a UNRWA employee took a pro-Israeli position and said, we want nothing to do with anti-Semitism, what would happen to him or her should they take that position? One, they wouldn't get the job in the first place, but say they hit it. And they say, you know, it's about time we got to tolerance and treated our Israeli and our Jewish friends with respect. What would happen to that person? Would they last the day? Would terrible things happen to them? And on the textbooks, I have met with the lobby forces. They've come around over the years for UNRWA, and they're very good at putting pretty much what we saw throughout the 80s and 90s when it came to communist dictatorships. I took on Nicholas Ceausescu in Romania and the Securitate, and every year the lobbyists in K Street would bring, because they wanted most favored nation status, and they had page after page of nice bullets of lies. And you'd look at it and say, but it worked. They kept MFN for years, most favored nation status, even though they were doing horrible things, in that case, to Christians in Romania as part of their dictatorship. My point is, a lobby firm and a lobby effort done here and elsewhere can put a gloss on the most egregious human rights abuse. So diversion, if you maybe could speak to that issue of funding. And what is taught? I've had briefings and hearings in the past. I had one witness once read from the textbooks in English, and it was not only anti-Jewish and anti-Israel, it was also anti-American. And it went page after page after page of that. They tell us that they clean up the textbooks, and we hear, you don't get a 15-year-old who is fanatically anti-Jewish and anti-Israel without starting at a very young age to inculcate that hate into that little boy and that little girl. And it works. It works. I've worked on the Charles Taylor issue. I've had hearings with the special prosecutor with regards to David Crane here in this room with what Charles Taylor did to hype up the young people to cut off arms and do horrible things. That's child abuse of the worst kind. And Hamas and the PLA does it every single day. And maybe you could clarify for the record, with regards to the content, the UN doesn't say what goes into those books, or the US or the donor nations. It comes from the PA, if I'm not mistaken. And again, that's highlighted again in the testimony in the most recent report that was put out. So I just want to underscore that. Handoff of UNHCR, you indicated, I think, Mr. Lincoln, you don't think that would happen. UNRWA is so flawed. If this was racism based on color of someone's skin, surely, and I was one of those Republicans who supported apartheid sanctions during the Reagan administration. And for a while, I was pretty much alone in that position. Finally, we all came to that position. So, because that was based on racism. Well, here we have a group that is all about racism against Jewish people. Well, we got to find some other entity, it would seem to me, because reform and the falseness of the reform in the past is numbing. Also, if I could, pay to slay. If that isn't an indicator of, we have Taylor Force, an American who in 2006 was killed, with a knife. 10 others were wounded. And what does his family get as he's languishing in prison? What do they get, and all others? They get a stipend, a lot of money from the Palestinian Authority. I still, my mind boggles at how cruel that is, and that's backed by a boss who has not gotten rid of pay to slay. The UN has been silent on that one for far too long as well. So you could maybe speak to the textbooks, I said this yesterday in a meeting we had with the ADL. That famous song, "You've Got to Be Taught," from South Pacific, Rodgers and Hammerstein. Hatred is taught, and it's being taught with aggressiveness every single day to the youngest of Palestinians, and that is child abuse of the worst kind, because they grow up loaded for bear to kill Jews and to end the state of Israel. They don't just come by that when they're 15. They grow into it, and UNRWA is the major conduit to that. Hello. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, you mentioned the WHO. It is indeed shameful that Dr. Tedros has neither retracted nor deleted his false tweet accusing Israel of attacking a hospital. That is a horrific accusation, and it's false and never happened. You mentioned the role of China in the WHO. That is significant, has never been properly addressed in Geneva. where I'm based. The WHO, the previous director was also China's candidate. Literally, China was campaigning for her. She was their candidate. And they have substantial influence, even symbolically. Two of the goodwill ambassadors of the WHO, one is James Chow, who works for Chinese state TV and is a paid propagandist of the Chinese regime. He's a WHO goodwill ambassador. During COVID, he was publishing a lot of stuff praising China's methods of dealing with COVID. So outright propaganda. We exposed him. We had 100 NGOs complain about him. Nothing happened. Another goodwill ambassador is Peng Liyuan. She is the first lady of China, the wife of Xi Jinping. She's a WHO goodwill ambassador. In 1989, she's a singer. She was serenading the perpetrators of the Tiananmen Square massacre. She's a WHO goodwill ambassador. So WHO has a lot to answer for. You spoke about UNRWA. Two issues, the aid and the education. On the aid, it's hard to get information on aid being diverted, but UNRWA itself, a couple weeks ago, reported that both fuel and medical equipment were removed from one of their warehouses and taken by the health authorities, which is Hamas. And they deleted their tweet an hour or two later, but Haaretz reported, Haaretz is a newspaper that is extremely critical of the Netanyahu government and generally supports UNRWA. They reported that according to their sources, this theft of UN humanitarian fuel and medical equipment did happen. According to the Israel Broadcasting Authority's Channel 11, 36,000 liters of fuel were taken. That is fuel that can run a hospital for a week and a half, can run a water desalination plant for a long period, stolen by Hamas terrorism. UNRWA education. We released our report, Impact SE has their report, and they talk about graduates of UNRWA who have committed terrorist attacks. And this is over the past 20 years, and they cite numerous graduates of UNRWA schools who commit terrorist attacks. So we, as the donor states, because all of our countries, whether you're American, Canadian, Swiss, French, British, we're all paying for UNRWA. America's the largest donor. We're told that it's an investment for peace. What UNRWA never says is, of the 3,000 or so terrorists who infiltrated into Israel, how many of them were UNRWA graduates? One of them apparently had an UNRWA certificate from a vocational school that was found in Israel, and it was published on the internet, and this person had it on their person, this terrorist. So UNRWA does not reveal those statistics, but obviously they're substantial. So it's a question whether UNRWA is really educating for peace. You asked, Mr. Chairman, about what would happen if a UN official would say, I oppose anti-Semitism. Well, we've never seen it, so it's a valid question, and I hope that our colleague will answer. But unwittingly, certain things happen. A couple years ago, the director of UNRWA in Gaza, a German national by the name of Matthias Schmel, no friend of the Jewish people, no friend of Israel, someone who tolerated lots of anti-Semitism when he was head of UNRWA in Lebanon. He was interviewed on TV, and they asked him, can you tell us about Israel's attacks? This is in May 2021. Can you tell us about Israel's attacks on Gaza? And he said, yeah, but they've been very precise. They're only hitting the terrorists, and haven't been hitting us, the civilians, UNRWA. And he didn't realize what he was saying, but he effectively acknowledged in very clear terms that Israel's attacks are precisely aimed at the terrorists. And Israel used his quotes and published his quotes, that the director of UNRWA confirms what we've been saying. Immediately, he became persona non grata in Gaza because he just said the truth. Wasn't trying to praise Israel, but he just said the truth. Became persona non grata. Suddenly, there were protests sprang up outside his office. He had to leave Gaza. He was fired. He had to get another job. So that is a partial answer to your question. Finally, no, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make note, when we talk about the WHO, every year during their annual conference, they devote a significant chunk of time just to excoriating Israel. This is part of their annual process. Even at the height of the pandemic, there was a full day dedicated at the WHO conference to talking about Israel, as if that had anything to do with the global pandemic. So you just get a little bit of a sense of the priorities of this particular UN agency. I would also note that right now, we all heard about the Al-Ahli hospital and the attack, or an errant rocket by the Islamic Jihad that created the explosion there. What we're not talking about yet, but what we will be talking about very soon, is the Al-Shifa hospital, which is based in Gaza City. Underneath the Al-Shifa hospital is the Hamas command center. It is several stories deep We believe that there could be Israeli hostages held there. We believe that there is fuel that's been diverted there. We believe there are rockets down there. And of course, there is the command center that Hamas uses for whatever is left of its fighting force in Gaza right now. How is it that the WHO has not come out and condemned Hamas for what we already know exists beneath this hospital? This would be the time that the WHO should be speaking out, and it makes one wonder why it is that they exist in the first place if they can't come out and speak about something as abhorrent as that. Now, as far as diversion of aid, we are hearing right now, the best reports that I'm getting from Gaza, from Israel, is that the aid that is coming through to the south, which is what the international community has carved out, it is being diverted to the north, where Hamas's military command center is. It is happening in the underground tunnels. UNRWA has not said a thing about this. There is, and I think, as you just heard from Hillel, this is a certain amount of self-censorship, right? The story of Matthias Schmel, is that how you pronounce his name? Yeah. We remember, that he actually, he ended up having to leave Gaza. He was persona non grata. There's a lesson in there that UNRWA can't speak out about these sorts of things if they want to maintain the access, right? And so what they've done is they've prioritized the mission over the revelation of a lot of key details that I think the world needs to know about. UNRWA has to stop that self-censorship. And by the way, I can just tell you as just an anecdote, a few years ago when I went to visit the southern communities around the Gaza Strip, we actually were able to go into some of the tunnels that had already been exposed, and you could see that there were the bags of cement with the UNRWA logo littered on the floor of these tunnels. So you get a sense of where the building material may have come from. UNHCR, I do believe that this is the only way forward. I know there will be resistance to it, but the point is that for the legitimate refugees that need to get the assistance, let's work through UNHCR. For those that are destitute, for those that are in need of services that right now UNRWA is providing, let's move them over to the Palestinian Authority. Why are we still using the UN when these are basic services that any other government should be providing? It makes no sense. Why did the Palestinians have this and no other people do? The textbooks, I'm going to leave that to people who follow this a lot more closely than I do. The excuse, though, that these are textbooks that come from other places and therefore they don't have influence, that is absolutely not something that anybody should accept. What is taught comes down to the teachers, it comes down to the staff, and of course we know that many of the staff in UNRWA have an affiliation or an affinity for Hamas. That has to change.
Thank you. Just a quick maybe word on a couple of these points on the aid diversion. From 2017 to 2021, I was the manager of something called the Gaza Reconstruction Mechanism, which was a mechanism that was created in the wake of the 2014 war, which to date was the most destructive, and Gaza, of course, pales in comparison to what's happening now. But essentially, we worked with the Palestinian Authority and with the Israeli authorities to facilitate the rebuilding after 2014. The mechanism was functional, and in fact, even after May 2021, the Israelis moved to actually try and strengthen it as part of their response. So just to say that accounted for the bulk of the reconstruction materials that came in after 2014 for the express purpose of rebuilding, and it had to do with UN doing end-use monitoring, etc. By no means a perfect system, but there were no complaints from the Israelis about that and about the diversion. It's understood that the cement and other materials come from other sources, including a completely unregulated and unchecked border between Egypt and Gaza that has been open since 2018. Just as one example. So that's important to mention. Also, just out of interest, Interestingly, and it was of great annoyance to me as an official as a UN official working with the UN Special Coordinator's office at the time, UNRWA maintained its own mechanism, direct mechanism with the Israelis on the entry of materials. Again, not something that was raised by the Israeli security establishment as an issue. Later on, of course, as part of its these efforts that have now come under great scrutiny on the part of the Netanyahu government to try and support the economy and particularly try and engage indirectly with Hamas, there were efforts to try and support the economy. And this included creating certain economic conditions on the ground. But this came from again, from the Netanyahu government, from the Israeli government. And so there were definitely excess materials on the ground. Now, whether or not Hamas used any of this for its tunnels, whether they were able to smuggle the goods in, I have no idea myself. We were only able to account, and pretty well, for the materials that came in for the UN and internationally funded projects. Just on the employees, UNRWA needs to investigate this and act swiftly.
Suspend.
Sorry.
UNRWA investigate? How about an outside, independent-minded body? I mean, here in this place, everything is about checks and balances. So everything, House, Senate, Republican, Democrat, GAO, which does independent analysis.
To bring it all together, to combine that with the textbooks, and again, I am no expert on the education curriculum. I have not worked in that in the past. UNRWA says that in cooperation with the U.S. and other donors, it takes measures to address racism and bias. I understand that there's some skepticism here. If they are insufficient, I would imagine that a coalition of the top donors, which includes the United States, European Union, Germany, as just the top three, could influence the required changes. It's a question of political will more than anything, and needs to be done in a multilateral fashion, just because of the nature of UNRWA and the way it works. There should be no obstacles within the UN system to this.
Can you tell us how you account for young people being so anti-Jewish and anti-Israel who have gone through the UNRWA schools? Is UNRWA anti-Semitic?
I would say that you have to understand what UNRWA is. UNRWA
I know what it is.
is providing services to 70% of the population of Gaza.
Including schools.
UNRWA, I think we need to focus more on the problem, which is Hamas. UNRWA is deeply flawed. It is not Hamas.
Your view on the pay to slay?
In terms
PLA?
of, there are a host of issues that are of deep concern regarding the governance of the Palestinian Authority.
Can you condemn that? I mean, killing Jewish and Americans and committing terrorism and then getting paid for it by the government.
Again, I'm putting it just in. Of course, condemn that, but you just putting it into the context of a broader necessity for reform within the Palestinian Authority. There have been many voices that are calling for this, and in particular, I would draw your attention to an article by Salam Fayyad in Foreign Affairs, former Palestinian Prime Minister, who has outlined a number of the vital reforms that are required in order to reinvigorate the Palestinian Authority if there is ever going to be any sort of future peace process or day after scenario that can stabilize the situation. Sorry, Mr. Chairman.
If a UNRWA teacher
Yes.
were to be pro-Israel and pro, what would happen to that person? And do you know of any who show a tolerance, at least, towards Jewish people?
I don't know any UNRWA teachers, and I can't answer the question, Mr. Chairman. But I do know that any of these horrible instances that have been raised by these reports should be dealt with immediately.
Thank you. Ms. Wild.
Okay, well, I'm going to take up where you just left off. Dealt with in what manner? These horrible instances that have been outlined. Tell us.
Teachers need to be fired.
Okay. I want to go back to something that is actually beyond the scope of your testimony, Mr. Lincoln, and I apologize in advance for that, but my colleague, Ms. Manning, raised it in her, I think it was Ms. Manning, raised it in her opening remarks, and it's one that I think, thank you, by the way, for your 15 years on the ground and for the time that you spent in Gaza and the West Bank and the work that you've done. I think that that gives you a firsthand view, that it makes you a very knowledgeable witness, and we can benefit from that. But my question is, why are there still refugee camps in Gaza?
As I mentioned in my testimony, and it's a bit strange to say, but the easiest way to get rid of UNRWA and consign it to history is, of course, in the context of a negotiated two-state solution. This was certainly what the framers of the Oslo process, perhaps naively, perhaps wishfully thought when they formed this process around 30 years ago. But ultimately, it has the status of refugees has always been considered one of the final status issues related to the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians. In terms of the existence of refugee camps on the ground in places like West Bank and Gaza, it's, of course, these refugee camps are actually have the appearance more of neighborhoods or towns than anything else. They've been there on the ground, as mentioned, for some 74, 75 years. But in terms of the, it's more an issue of the status of these people pending a political resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is, for better or for worse, the mandate that UNRWA has been given by the United Nations.
Okay, I understand that's your view. The idea that the refugees of 1948 and 1949 are continuing to be served by UNRWA, I think, is, preposterous. And so what we're talking about is successive generations of people who are essentially born into refugee status. Is that what we're talking about?
Yes, you're.
Okay. And you said that 70% of the population of Gaza is provided services by UNRWA.
Around 1.5 million beneficiaries in Gaza.
So, you also made reference in answer to my question about why there are still refugee camps, which you described as neighborhoods. Fair enough, but they're neighborhoods consisting of people who are registered refugees. Yes.
Correct.
And you described it as being part of the final political process of creating peace in the Middle East, which who knows whether that will ever come. And I'm not here to argue with you by any means. You are here as our witness, but I want you to shed some light on why it is that Israel, which was willing to accept this two-state solution, is now suffering from the effects of the anti-Semitism that even you acknowledge exists in the UN and in UNRWA. And I'm just going to leave that there. You don't need to actually answer that. That's more of a rhetorical question. But I am deeply concerned about the anti-Semitism that we see in the UN and UN agencies. You speak glowingly, and I would agree with you, on the role of former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan and his fight against anti-Semitism. You quoted his statement, which I thought was a beautiful one. But what I'd like to know from you, since you've obviously studied the UN and you've studied Secretary General Annan's shepherding of it, what can be done to eliminate that anti-Semitism as he called for so many years ago?
Thank you for the question.
The softball question.
Sure. No, absolutely. Leadership.
Not really.
Leadership matters. in any organization, it matters at the United Nations as well. Kofi Annan's words, although they were written some time ago, echoed very strongly throughout the system, and also set an example for the member states and for the member state bodies. It will never, the sort of dichotomy between the United Nations as both the stage and the member state bodies and the actor is one that the stage, unfortunately, is a reflection of the world and a reflection of at least opinions of states. So when we talk about these entities, for example, special rapporteurs, Human Rights Council, as Hillel and others have very, rightly and very strongly brought up some of the deep concerns about how they function. Again, when we say that these are, UN opinions, UN thoughts, or somehow UN resolutions, it's important to understand where they come from. And the leadership that was demonstrated by not just Kofi Annan, but other Secretary Generals in this regard, and Kofi Annan, of course, had no problem calling this out in a very similar way that we heard from the colleagues here today. And he lamented it not only for the anti-Semitism and for the concern that it is, but also that it brought us no closer to peace, and it ultimately did nothing for the Palestinians and their search for self-determination as well.
When is the last time the United Nations had a Secretary General who called out anti-Semitism? I'm not
you
trying,
asking me?
Yeah, I'm not trying to give you a trick question. I'm just curious.
Antonio Gutierrez has made some statements to that effect. I think definitely speaking, definitely from a historical perspective, Kofi Annan sets the standard, and then of course it was continued by his successor, Ban Ki-moon. You have seen similar statements, especially during visits of the current Secretary General to Israel, in which he was, of course, hosted by Prime Minister Netanyahu. I was on the ground supporting that trip, where he made some, very clear statements. I don't have them at hand. So you do hear this, but again, I think that the standard and the ability to relate it specifically to the ongoing conflict and to separate some of these issues out was definitely set by Secretary General Kofi Annan.
I'm going to ask one other area, and then I'll pass to my colleagues, but I may come back and ask some more. Obviously, your position is that we need to work to reform and improve UNRWA, not abolish it. I'd be interested to know if you have any specific thoughts about what we do to improve and reform it. I'll just end there.
Sure. I think that the best place to start with regard to UNRWA is to sort of understand that it's this creation of the General Assembly, and it's to me, the root of a number of these flaws are that it falls between the cracks with regard to accountability in general, and this is what we heard from some of the other colleagues as well. I do see the Secretariat, the Secretary General in particular, being able to take on more of a role. There's also the, and I'm sure the colleagues would have a lot to say about it, but within the Department of Peace Building and Political Affairs, there is also the Division of Palestinian Rights within. And again, with a view to clarifying accountability frameworks. Who's in charge? Who is in charge of UNRWA? And then also with a goal to try and sharpen its humanitarian and development roles on the ground, I think would go a long way to addressing a number of the key shortcomings of the agency, including some of the issues that the colleagues raised, very real and serious issues that the colleagues raised today. In my opinion, this cannot be done bilaterally. The United States has tried both ways, either as the biggest donor to exercise the leverage in that respect, or to defund. Neither will work. It's a multilateral entity. This is the United Nations. We need to work with allies, and there is a lot of common ground. But if we do it just solely based on one particular issue or one particular set of issues, then it will likely be less successful, is my view.
Sorry, I said that was my last. I have one last. So with your focus on improving the actual humanitarian rebuilding efforts on the ground in Gaza, my question to you is, how does that get done with Hamas present?
Two sets of issues. One is I can tell you from my experience how we did it after the 2014 war. And you're hearing...
You think it's applicable now? Sure.
Yeah, because you're hearing a lot of the same things. And again, we don't know how this particular conflict is going to end. We don't know. And what will be on the ground.
Let's even talk about prior to October 7th, okay?
Okay.
So before this conflict started, UNRWA was on the ground, but not providing the focus level of humanitarian support that you think is optimal, right? And I guess my question is, so how is that supposed? Let's talk about before October 7th.
It is largely because of Hamas and because of Hamas's presence that UNRWA is actually strengthened on the ground. Because a lot of donors would prefer to give to a UN agency that has some degree of accountability, rather than working with ministries that some have closer ties with Hamas than others. The problem has always been that, and we saw this, and it's applicable to the current context and as a lesson learned for the future. After 2014, you saw a reinvigorated sense from the Palestinian Authority that they were going to play a role in the reconstruction on the ground. This was what the Gaza reconstruction mechanism was all about, and this was what the political efforts were. Because of Hamas's existence, continued existence on the ground, and because of its own internal divisions and its own political problems within the Palestinian body politic, between the Palestinian Authority and the Hamas de facto government in Gaza, it broke down. And the engagement of the Palestinian Authority wavered over time because they felt that it was working too much to support, not to support necessarily, but to take Hamas, the Hamas government, off the hook with regard to governance.
I'll stop you there. Mr. Schanzer, you wanted to
Yeah, look, I want to just point out something, and it should be obvious, but maybe it isn't. UNRWA helped perpetuate Hamas rule, starting in 2007 when Hamas took over the Gaza Strip by force in a brutal civil war in which they toppled the Palestinian Authority. Hamas has been the sovereign basically for 16 years. It failed to provide basic services to its own people because, surprise, terrorist groups don't care about providing basic services.
Mr. Lincoln,
but
do you disagree with what he just said? Sorry.
It's not just UNRWA.
What he just specifically said. Do you disagree with that?
That terrorist groups are not interested.
No, it's before that.
That UNRWA helped perpetuate Hamas rule.
I don't think that that's completely accurate. I think it's far more nuanced.
Okay. I'm going to yield to my colleague, Mr. Schneider.
I'll yield too. Oh, okay. And frankly, we'll go to a member of the committee, Ms. Banning.
Thank you. I was going to say.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lincoln, UNRWA is meant to provide certain basic services to the population that it serves, such as education and health care. However, in meetings with members and staff, some UNRWA officials seem to believe that they are there to perpetuate the right of return. In your view, what is the proper role of UNRWA?
UNRWA is not there to perpetuate the right of return. If some of the individuals are from the organization are stating so, then that's not correct. Of course, there has been over time a politicization of its mandate, exactly as you have laid out. And again, this is something that has been perpetuated through the Palestinian Authority's textbooks and other means.
So what should we be doing to focus UNRWA on what its mandate is and not what its mandate should not be?
As I laid out in my testimony, I believe that a multilateral effort towards looking at the shortcomings of the United Nations with regard to this conflict in general, which includes UNRWA, is required. I think that also just on a broader sense, there are many other issues. The current iteration of the United Nations on the ground stems back from the Oslo peace process from 1993 and 1994. There are aspects of it that no longer make sense.
So let me go a step further. How would you assess UNRWA, UNESCO, the UN Human Rights Council, other agencies in terms of their fidelity to the UN's own principles of neutrality and tolerance?
I'm not familiar with all of them. We're talking about some actors on the ground, some member state bodies whose positions are defined by states, like UNESCO. So it's a little bit difficult to compare all of those together. The problem, as I mentioned, and I think that, again, we're talking about a somewhat of a systemic problem, is that in 1994, there was a division of responsibility, more or less, for the peace process. The United States was in charge of the negotiations. The European Union and others, including the United Nations, were asked by the parties and the United States to engage on the ground and support the development of Palestinian institutions and support the Palestinian people. Now, with a peace process collapsed, especially in light of the current conflict, the United Nations has the appearance less of a conflict resolution mechanism and more of an advocate, perhaps, of one side. This needs to be updated because of the situation. But again, if and when, and you hear this also from the administration on the need to reinvigorate a peace process in the wake of all of this horrible carnage that we see on the ground, you can better believe that the UN will be asked to play a role. What role that is, whether it's a circumscribed role, whether it's a greater role or not, of course, depends on a number of factors, including how the war continues and how it ends.
So there were remarks that were made by a Hamas political wing leader that were shown on TV, on the news, where he stated that it was the responsibility of Hamas to fight against Israel and to protect its fighters with their underground tunnels. And in response to questions, he said that they did not have a responsibility to allow the people, the Palestinian people, to get shelter from attacks in those tunnels, that the responsibility of the Palestinian people was solely held by the United Nations. Can you comment on that? And can you also help us understand, has there ever been a comprehensive review of the population that UNRWA serves to identify how many people actually meet the UN High Commissioner for Refugees' definition of a refugee?
Just on your last point, I'm not familiar with that aspect, and again, I should clarify for the committee, I'm not and have not ever been a staff member of UNRWA. I worked for a different part of the UN, but I will say that the comment that you mentioned from the I believe it was Musa Abu Marzouk from Hamas. This is a very common perception. Held not just by Hamas, but by Palestinian political bodies in general. And it's primarily a misunderstanding of the UN's role on the ground. Of course, there are a number of UN agencies that operate similar to how UN agencies operate anywhere in the world that support systems on the ground to provide services to the population. And in the West Bank and Gaza, you have 22 of them. UNRWA is a little bit different. And I think that, again, if we go to the heart of it, UNRWA's mode of operation and its sort of direct service model is what sets it apart, and in some ways is what is at the root of some of the issues that a wide array of donors have been concerned with for many years.
So you would agree that the comment made by that Hamas leader of the political wing is wrong, that it is the responsibility of the elected government to take care of the Palestinian people who live in Gaza?
That's correct. And of course, in a context like Gaza, and as in many other places in the world, the work of UN agencies is often conflated with the work of governments.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Schanzer, what are the best ways we can now support targeted humanitarian assistance to make sure that it gets to the people of Gaza who are actually the victims of Hamas?
It's a good question. During the war itself, what we have right now is the southern part of the Gaza Strip, which has been sort of cordoned off. The problem right now is diversion from the south to the north. And unfortunately, there's probably going to need to be some sort of military solution to destroy those tunnels so that the aid stays in the south and doesn't get diverted to Hamas in the north. I don't know how else to do it because UNRWA is not stopping it, and nor are the people on the ground. So there is a huge problem. I think I can't even tell you what the percentage is of the goods that are coming through that are being passed underground to the north, but it's a serious problem.
And does UNRWA have the ability to stop the confiscation of those goods by Hamas?
This is what we were talking about. I mean, first of all, you don't see people walking around sort of armed